And joining us now on the debate, Romesh Hettiarachchi. He is articling in law. Sudami Pulogasingham. She is a retail consultant and an MBA at the Schulich School of Business. Jyothi Shanmugam. She's a criminology student at the University of Toronto. We should say that all three are part of the Young Canadians Peace Dialogue on Sri Lanka, hosted by the Mosaic Institute. Let's also introduce R. Charan, who's with the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Windsor, and Craig Scott, professor at Osgoode Hall Law School and is with the Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice. Craig, I have been practicing your name all day just to try to get it right. I think I got close. Thanks everybody for coming to TVO tonight to have this discussion, which comes 2 years and a week after the end of the Civil War that we're going to talk about over the next period of time. I want to just say a couple things off the top. Number one, those who are watching us who, when we have done this topic in the past, may be accustomed to seeing people representing various organizations that are well known. We didn't invite them today. We've purposely invited you because you folks, I think, represent people who are more in the middle as opposed to highly identified with any one particular side of this. And you're here talking for yourselves. You're not here as spokespeople for any particular group, so we wanted to do that as well. Now, with that, the Civil War did end, May 18th, 2009, 2 years, 1 week ago. And I want to just start by getting you to kind of recapture your emotions of the day when you heard the news. So, okay, Sudami, why don't you start us out?
Sure. I think when the war ended, for myself personally, being of Tamil background, there was a lot of grief for the people who had passed away in terms of the innocent civilians, as well as, of course, there are young people within the Sri Lankan army who had passed away as well. So it was definitely a day of very mixed emotions because of that grief, but as well there was some hope that potentially there could be a solution to the war and that there could be some form of political reconciliation that could come out of it.
We'll pick up on that during the course of our discussion. Romesh, how about you?
I think with me, I was very, very happy. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I think the war was good to be over. I had never known actually Sri Lanka to be at a time of peace. But I think my joy was tempered at the fact that the victory came at a very high human cost. Mm-hmm. By all indicators, something tragic had gone on, and a number of lives were lost. And I think that was something that definitely tempered any elation that I had.
That the war was over.
That the war was over, yeah.
Jyothi.
As a Tamil Canadian, I was highly involved in the protest leading up to sort of the last phase of the war. So when I found out on the 18th of May, like you indicated, that the hostilities were over, the combat was over, I knew that the conflict was still far from over. I think there was a phase of denial and disappointment, but also hope.
Sure.
Well, I had mixed feelings. First of all, it was a relief because the conventional war was over. But I was also very traumatized by the events, and what happened to a lot of my relatives and friends. I have lost more than 80 people, friends and relatives. And I was also really, really afraid about the future. What is going to happen to these people in the near future? And then that was the most important feeling for me.
Craig, usually when wars end, there is an attempt, anyway, at some kind of political reconciliation. People put water in their wine. Sides move. Has that happened in the 2 years and 1 week since the end of the Civil War?
I think it would be difficult to say that it's happened. I think there's too many activities going on both sides, if you like, the government and what was formerly the LTTE, now a much more diffuse Tamil community. I don't think there's much that looks like political reconciliation that's yet taken hold for all kinds of reasons.
Jyothi, I want to pick up on something you just said a second ago because I think people who live in Toronto remember well that very famous protest where you and your colleagues simply took over the Gardiner Expressway. You moved downtown, you got onto the expressway in the middle of rush hour, took it over. Peaceful protest, but still inconvenienced a lot of people. How did you go from that to being part of a group that is trying to find some reconciliation right now?
I think we have to remember that it was a very, it was an emotionally sensitive period. Many of us had lost families in that conflict, like Professor Charan had just mentioned. And at the time, it felt like the right thing to do. We wanted the attention of not only the media, but also the wider Canadian community for the right reasons. We wanted to make sure that our voice was heard. We wanted to make sure that the international community was aware of the atrocities that were unfolding in Sri Lanka at the time.
And now this effort at reconciliation. Why that?
I think what I've come to realize, it's actually taken me, it's been a personal journey, and it's been the last 10 years that it's taken me to get here. And what I realized is there's, on the side of the Sri Lankan government, what the diaspora tends to do is, with both of our communities, based on their ethnic affiliations, they pick sides, naturally. So for a 10-year period, when I was learning about the conflict, I was growing up in a home, in a community that often had many stories to share about the conflict, it was the obvious thing to do. I did not know of an alternative. It was the right thing to do. So on the Tamil side, you would side with your community, and on the Sinhalese side, you would side with the Sinhalese community. And what the Tamil side would do is point fingers, and they would accuse the Sri Lankan government. So all the same scenarios that you would read in the newspapers about the Sri Lankan government, as the UN report just indicated recently, of the war crimes and issues about human rights violations, the Sri Lankan government not having transparency, the issue of lack of press freedom, the systematic discrimination of the Tamils that started from the 1950s with the Language Act and that continued on to this day, the treatment of Tamils as second-class citizens within their own country. These are the issues that the Tamil community held on to very, very strongly.
Okay, let me get Sudami to follow up on that.
Sure. I just want to also talk about the protests because I think that was a very important part of Canadian history as well. And really, I think the message there was that, you know, the protests were actually a physical manifestation of the emotional grief that the Tamil Canadian diaspora was feeling at that time. And I think, you know, we've all been on this journey where we've been involved with the Young Canadians Peace Dialogue as well. And the importance of those types of initiatives is that not only does it give a space for Tamil Canadians, but it also gives a space for Sinhalese Canadians. So just amongst my friends, and I have both Tamil and Sinhalese friends, I have Sinhalese friends who are actually anti-war, but the protests was no place for them. They did not feel welcome there, and it wasn't a place where they could speak their mind. So there really was this void in terms of where could people who consider themselves, you know, to be rational, to have opinions that are similar to each other, but they're from different ethnic backgrounds, there really was no space for them to go.
Well, let's follow up because you're sitting beside a Sinhalese right
Yes.
now. Okay, Romesh, you, and from what I hear, you weren't particularly involved or political when the Civil War was going on, but now you're taking a bigger chunk out of this. How come?
I think I would first like to say I think that we should try and stay away from words like rational and objective, because I think that for many people the war is something incredibly emotional. As Sharon just mentioned, people's lives were lost, and a lot of people's futures were affected, on both sides and in all communities. And so a lot of people are really tied to the consequences and of what happens later. In regards to my involvement, the reason why I started becoming involved was I really felt the need that there needs to be new conversations within the different Sri Lankan communities. In the aftermath of the war, and I think even on this show, both sides were really focusing and emphasizing on who was to blame and who was a war criminal, who were a terrorist, and that was the focus of the debate. There was very little conversation around what is the future of Sri Lanka going to be. And I really do believe that we are not, like our past does not determine our future. And we actually have a choice to make a better Sri Lanka if we make the choice to.
Well, here's part of what makes this so difficult and intractable, and that is our producer Daniel Kitts, I think, produced his first program on this a few years ago, and ever since then, not a week has gone by without him being inundated, and I mean inundated, by people from all sides in this thing. And I want to read a couple of excerpts of the kind of thing. He got both of these on just this past Sunday. Michael Smith, if you would. The first impression of a visitor who has visited Sri Lanka before is that it is safe to travel in the country. After more than 3 decades, the ever-present danger of a terrorist bomb in public places has been erased. In the north and east, where the LTTE restricted travel and enforced taxes on visitors and commercial goods, movement is free. The small towns are prospering again, with shops full of local and imported goods and small restaurants. Near some Hindu temples, which are usually crowded with worshippers, modern ice cream parlors are a big attraction. Okay, he got that. He also got this. Next excerpt. International human rights laws and fundamental freedoms are being routinely violated by Sri Lanka with impunity while being witnessed by the international community. Ethnic Tamils are being arrested, detained, abducted, tortured, raped, summarily executed, and are being illegally confined in the hundreds of thousands inside internment camps lacking sufficient aid or care. Craig, how are we to kind of figure out what's going on when we have such wildly divergent views of what's going on?
I think probably one of the only ways is that at some point external actors from the UN to well-positioned non-governmental organizations have to be part of brokering the truth, if you like, and arriving at the truth in a way that different communities can see the information as being more objective. Nothing can be fully objective, but more objective.
Which of these two passages I just read would you say is more objective?
I can't speak to the first one. It doesn't coincide with my information about what's going on in the north and the east. I think there's a lot more closure there, but maybe that's simply for journalists and other actors who can't go in. It could well be truer than not. Doesn't strike me as fully correct. The second one, there are elements, small elements of that are certainly going on now at the level of individual human rights violations, but the broad sweep statements seem to be locked into what the situation was before.
Romesh.
I usually tend to steer away from objectivity, but I think that when you're talking about the internment camps, the vast majority of internment camps have actually been closed. And I think that it's just a factual inaccuracy. And I think that the biggest issue right now in terms of reconciliation piece is that a lot of communities don't know how to do it. Reconciliation is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And people don't even know how to start the conversation. And again, it comes back to what I said earlier. Both generations they've never had the background. They're very much focused on conversations that are not constructive.
Jyoti.
What happens when these reports often come out is both of our communities pick their sides. So with the Tamil diaspora, I think it's safe to say that they will point fingers at the Sri Lankan government as being all guilty of what they've done. Mm-hmm. But then on the other hand, they don't look at the side of the LTTE. And the truth is, there have been reports from the International Crises Group and Human Rights Watch and from Amnesty of the human rights violations that the LTT have carried out, from using civilians as human shields during the last combat phase in 2009, also recruiting children as child soldiers, as well as, let's not forget, the atrocities they committed in 1990 and 1992 to the Muslim Sri Lankans.
I've got stuff I'm going to read about all this coming up shortly. Let me do Charan, and then I want to hear from Sutami as well.
Well, quickly 2 points. The first point is that even though the internment camps have been closed, but the latest UN report released 2 weeks ago, it says that 100,000 people are unable to go to their places. So that is the first point. The second point, and the larger issue here, is the militarization of the northern east. For every 4 person in the eastern province, there is 1 soldier, and in the northern province, for every 3 person, every 3 person, there is a soldier. And the army militarization is the key issue there, because basically military runs everything, including restaurants, the civil administration, and all kinds of things are being run by the military. And then there is no space for civil society. So that is the fundamental thing. As long as that remains, the issue of reconciliation is going to be extremely difficult.
Sudami.
I want to add, just in terms of the quotes that you had shown earlier as well, like I think there was a great article as well in the Globe and Mail about, who's actually profiting from the peace dividend. And it goes back to, yes, there is a need for reconciliation, but there is also a need to address the issues, the grievances of the Tamil minority as well as other minorities, which were the cause of the civil conflict in the first place. And so, Professor Sharon has touched upon it as well, but the economic opportunity, while there is development in the north and the east, it's very important, I think, for the Sri Lankan government and the Sri Lankan people to ensure that that is actually shared with the people who are living in the north and east. And from reports that I've been getting as well, the beneficiaries tend to be agencies, the government, and people from the south. So, there's a great quote that Buddha actually said, in Sri Lanka is a Buddhist country, where it goes, happiness shared is not happiness divided, right? So you can grow happiness by actually sharing it.
How constructive, Craig, do you think? I mean, here are three young people who are involved in an international effort to improve things. How constructive can this be?
Well, I think it certainly can be. You can't predict what directions it will go, but it's both heartening and inspiring to see this kind of effort. And it certainly has to be core to the way that Sri Lanka will eventually come out of this. Eventually is completely up in the air, what that means about when.
How important is the diaspora in whatever solution is finally found there?
I think it's pretty clear from most thoughtful studies that you can't disentangle at least the Tamil diaspora from what goes on the island. There's just too many interconnections, both historical and just factual. The engagement is just too strong with something like 1 million Tamil people outside of Sri Lanka. I'm less well versed in the broader Sri Lankan diaspora, but I think that the demonstrator and maybe the multiplier effects of outside of Sri Lanka dialogue efforts like this could be extremely important, especially if they look inside the country and look to the examples that are going on inside.
Sharon, the diaspora, how important?
Well, I mean, it's extremely important because the diaspora has become, the one side of the coin that is the people that are living in the northern east, and I agree, and I really I'm happy that these youngsters are doing really good work in terms of engaging with in kinds of development. But one of the issues that we need to be focusing is in order to bring about or talk about reconciliation, we need to first address the issue of truth and acknowledgement. So there is a huge responsibility on the part of the Sri Lankan state to accept the truth and and acknowledge that these things have happened. So that is not taking place. So from a perspective of the ordinary Sinhalese people and the ordinary Tamil people, the Sinhalese people should, progressive Sinhalese people should step up and say, this is exactly what happened. We need to take responsibility. In a similar way, the Tamil people also should stand up and say that we have also committed all kinds of things because we have not challenged, the atrocities committed by the LTT. And they also have to, this is the beginning.
I'm going to get to this. Romesh, you wanted to say?
I think admitting that you're wrong takes a lot of guts. And I think that both communities are just not at that stage yet. And I think that one of the things that the Young Canadians Peace Dialogue tries to do is open up some very difficult conversations that need to be had both within communities as well as between. Both Mr. Scott and Professor Sharon have talked about the role of the diaspora. President Rajapaksa was elected with a 57% majority. And I think that topics of human rights aren't necessarily the electoral question, as maybe the Canadian example could demonstrate. Usually how economic policies are usually win over issues about democracy or issues about human rights. I think
we saw an example of that on May 2nd in this country.
That's what I was referring to. But I guess what I would say, in terms of the diaspora can certainly inform the conversation that can be had within Sri Lanka. The conversation within Sri Lanka can either be influenced by a conversation outside that's antagonistic and with enmity and anger, or it can be influenced by a conversation outside that says, you know what, something's gone wrong, something needs to change, and how can we change this in a collaborative, constructive way?
Well, Craig, I mean, 2 years is a long time in one respect, but in another respect, given how long this has been going on, it's not that long at all. Should we, I mean, we can't, I shouldn't ask it. I shouldn't say it, I should ask it. How much progress is it reasonable to assume should have taken place after 2 years?
Well, I would like to see us further along, and what Sharon was referring to as the truth and acknowledgement side. I think we're unfortunately far away from that basic starting point of even accepting that some kind of truth-oriented accountability process is needed. There is a reconciliation commission that we'll see. We have to see what it will come up with, but isn't likely to produce too much. But 2 years is, in the broad sweep of history, not a long time, and the Sri Lankan government is actually very good at pointing out historical examples of how many other countries have taken a very long time to get over at least as events in their history that are as bad. You look at Spain, you look at countries like France, you look at Germany after the war. There are elements of non-truth-telling and non-accountability that persist to this day in those countries. And so I think we do have to be well aware of a certain hypocrisy that is perceived in Sri Lanka, that there's kind of an idea that double standards are being placed upon them. There's some element of truth there.
Okay, get comfortable, because I got a lot to read here. This is from, you all know, less than 2 months ago, the United Nations Secretary General had an expert committee, an expert panel report on accountability in Sri Lanka, and I want to read a relatively long excerpt, and since you've all been hinting at it as we've been talking along, it seems like a good time now to bring this up. Okay, Michael, if you would. The government shelled on a large scale in 3 consecutive no-fire zones where it had encouraged the civilian population to concentrate, even after indicating that it would cease the use of heavy weapons. The government systematically shelled hospitals on the front lines. All hospitals in the Vani region were hit by mortars and artillery. Some of them were hit repeatedly, despite the fact that their locations were well known to the government. The government also systematically deprived people in the conflict zone of humanitarian aid in the form of food and medical supplies. It purposefully underestimated the number of civilians who remained in the conflict zone. Tens of thousands lost their lives from January to May 2009. Despite the grave danger in the conflict zone, the LTTE, Tigers, refused civilians permission to leave, using them as hostages, at times even using their presence as a strategic human buffer between themselves and the advancing Sri Lankan army. It implemented a policy of forced recruitment through the war, but in the final stages greatly intensified its recruitment of people of all ages, including children as young as 14. From February 2009 onwards, the LTTE started point-blank shooting of civilians who attempted to escape the conflict zone, significantly adding to the death toll in the final stages of the war. It also fired artillery in proximity to large groups of internally displaced persons and fired from or stored military equipment near IDPs or civilian installations such as hospitals. Throughout the final stages of the war, the LTTE continued its policy of suicide attacks. It perpetrated a number of attacks against civilians outside the conflict zone. Okay, lots to unpack here. Jyothi, get us started. Your reaction to some of the specifics of this United Nations report.
I think this goes back to your question about why I started participating in the Mosaic Institute's Peace Dialogue series. And that goes back to reports such as this. When you have the fact before you and you start to weigh both sides, and you come to the realization that both sides are equally guilty of different types of crimes. Both are in the wrong. And then you get caught between, the diasporas get caught between the politics. And then you stop and you question and you ask the difficult questions and you say, where do I go from here? What could I do for my community? What could I do for my people? What could I do for a united Sri Lanka? Because what happens is when we start pointing fingers at the Sri Lankan government, or when the Sinhalese community starts pointing fingers at the LTT for what they've done, we forget about those who are caught in the middle, the civilians. And I think that's exactly what the Peace Dialogue series tried to address. And that's also what our campaign, the Build Change campaign that's trying to build water wells in the war-affected area of Wani, that's what this reconciliation process is trying to do.
Okay. Sudami, what do you say?
Sure. I mean, I think, what the UN report basically is getting at also is that violence begets violence, right? So moving forward for Sri Lanka, we have to look at how can we preclude this violence. And definitely, I think the Sri Lankan diaspora, whether they're Tamil or Sinhalese, have a large role to play. I think it's very important for the Sri Lankan diaspora to, yes, acknowledge that, as Jyoti said, that there were wrongs committed on both sides, and there should be a good system of justice. But before we can even get there, we should also be, I think, advising the Sri Lankan government to actually implement mechanisms within the country so that these issues can be addressed.
Romesh.
Both Tamil and Jyoti have raised the fact that losses were suffered equally. And I think I'm going to take an alternate take. I think that while there's a lot of grievances around the war or whatnot, during the last stages of the war, I think that the primary impact of those stages were felt primarily by one community, namely that of the Tamil community. And I think that 2 years later, those losses and that impact is still felt. And I think, and a conversation really needs to happen in the government about the consequences of those stages, as well as what Professor Shan was talking about earlier about the militarization. There's only so much that we can talk about the war before you're actually starting to impact a population both psychologically and emotionally. And a conversation needs to happen around that, saying, how do we transition to a more peaceful environment for these people that have suffered greatly?
Sharon.
Well, it is good that you showed us a clip from the UN report, and then the government of Sri Lanka has completely rejected the report. And then what we saw is a fact, and also it is actually the tip of the iceberg. There are all kinds of information out there that we need to know. The only way to know all these truths is to call for an international independent inquiry. So that is one of the key issues. And the second issue, this is an issue particularly for the Tamil community, particularly the diasporic Tamil community all over the world. Because so far, they have accepted the UN report, and they want to, they have commemorated the War Crimes Day, and they want the international community and the UN to initiate the process. But it seems to me that they have convincingly forgotten that both parties are guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So that particular aspect need to be focused, need to be addressed by the Tamil community in Sri Lanka and also in the diaspora. That is one of the most important ways that we as Tamils could rise up against all these things and to face all the other challenges that are ahead.
Craig, how much do you need to focus on what happened in the past before you can discuss the way forward for the future?
I unfortunately think you cannot disentangle the two, and you do have to always be addressing the past, as I've said a few times, through serious truth-telling, because it won't be long before if a blinkered history goes forward into the future, the wounds will reopen, and the myths and the untruths will start to solidify, and new conflicts will arise. I think there's no way that you can't address, at minimum, an accountability based on truth. Whether that goes to the next stage of prosecutions and all this stuff, that's a separate issue. We need an accountability process that's focused on truth.
Okay, appreciate that, but Jyoti, help us on this. Doing that could very well inflame again, right? And bring all of the old passions to the surface again. Are you concerned about that?
I think the message I would want the young Tamil Canadians to get out of this would be, we can never abandon our history. Our history makes our present. The war in Sri Lanka gives me the identity of a Tamil Canadian. This will always be part of me and always be part of my history. I first started feeling the effects of the war when I was 5 years old, when my family was displaced many times before immigrating to Canada, and 17 years later, I still feel the effects of this war till today, because I still have a large number of family members who are in both the North and in Colombo. So we can never forget the past. We can never forget what happened to us. But what I want to tell the Tamil and Sinhalese youth is, how much of your past are you going to take with you to foster into positive change, to move forward?
That's a great question.
We cannot stop, we cannot hold on to our past, and we can't let our past hinder us from moving forward. And so when I try to balance what happened in Sri Lanka, and when I try to look at the atrocities committed by the Sri Lankan government and the atrocities committed by the LTT, my question was, the difficult question I asked was, as a Tamil Canadian, how am I going to move forward by not forgetting my past, but also not letting that past stop me from moving forward as a Canadian, as a Tamil?
You've self-identified several times here as a Tamil Canadian rather than a Sri Lankan Canadian. Purposefully, obviously, right?
I
Do you
wouldn't
not feel like a Sri Lankan?
I would not say purposefully, because I think, like many of the speakers acknowledged today, the Sri Lankan government is still far from including the Tamil community within a united Sri Lanka. So I think when the Sri Lankan government does take an active role to do that, I think the Tamils will feel as part of Sri Lanka.
Okay, so Dami, tell me, this report that I've just quoted from extensively talks a lot about the past. Does it offer a path for the future?
I think, in talking about the past, it is important for the future, and so as a result, it does. There are several recommendations that have come out of this report as to how the Sri Lankan government could actually, provide justice and provide accountability to the victims of the war. So there is a path for the future there, definitely. And the Sri Lankan government has, of course, started this path with a lessons learned commission. But the question that is going to come out for much of the diaspora is, what are going to be the actionable results of that commission? And that has yet to be seen. If there are actionable results that come out that can provide accountability and provide some form of justice, I think they will have a very strong support from the Tamil diaspora as well as other Sri Lankans in other countries.
Romesh?
I think the past is a very difficult issue. I know that for a large amount of Sinhalese Canadians, and specifically Sinhalese Canadians, that was intentional. I think that the past is something we should forget about if we should move on with the future. I generally have responded to that to saying that asking someone to forget the past is asking someone to forget their grandmother or grandfather, brother, sister.
No, it's not on.
It's very difficult to do. I think it's impossible, but I think that the issue is that in this particular conflict, specifically when lives have been lost, asking someone to forget the past is just disrespectful.
Okay, how about this then, Craig? The notion of an independent Tamil state. Is part of the reconciliation process an obligation to let that idea go?
On this, I wouldn't like to be too prescriptive. I think that the space has to open in Sri Lanka for that kind of idea to be freely debatable and put forward in political discourse, not to be treated as treason, for example. Personally, I think that the
That's
Tamil...
pretty tough, There's still some people in Canada who consider it treasonous to talk about Quebec as an independent country.
But it would be a sign of an advancement in maturity that it can at least be debated. Personally, I think the Tamil community will make its own a huge contribution to a way forward if it generally backs off of hardline pursuit of a state and focuses far more on creative forms of federalism or confederalism, and tries to convince the Sinhalese community with time, but hopefully fairly soon, that this is a much better way forward for the country.
I'm down to about a minute and a half here, and Sudami, I want you to speak to that if you would. The idea of an independent Tamil state, is that something that the Tamil community needs to let go of?
Sure. I think it is important to let go of that, because I think, we're at a stage, we're at a crossroads right now, and the Tamil diaspora can actually have a huge impact by looking to other solutions, as Craig has mentioned, like a devolution of powers, which would not only be effective and helpful to the Tamil minorities and other minorities in Sri Lanka, but to all regions. So even Sinhalese people would be benefiting from that type of a solution.
Charan, what do you say on that?
Well, the question of a separate state for Tamil arose in the aftermath of the failure of all kinds of other negotiation, demanding federalism, demanding all kinds of non-violent peaceful protest. And it came as a result of certain kinds of social, political, historical reality. So, and then, we cannot simply argue that the Tamil people should not have the right to talk about separate state. So there should be a democratic discourse, whether it is a federalist or sovereignist. But the problem here is that, I always argue that the notion of Tamil as a separate state for Tamil will materialize only because of the inability of the Sri Lankan state to reform itself, accommodate the minorities, and that will be the only reason why, in the future, it may materialize.
Okay, we give the professor the last word on this program. Jyothi, Romesh, Sudami, thank you so much for coming in tonight and helping us with this conversation. And Charon on the other side of the table, along with Craig Scott from Osgoode Hall. We appreciate all of your contributions tonight. Thank you.